began the terrible storm that raged without let-up from the 18th to the 26th of March. Its ravages were terrible, not only in America, but in Europe and Asia as well, where the storm traveled a distance of 1,800 miles. But while towns were being destroyed and forests uprooted, a drama no less exciting was taking place in the air. A huge balloon, which had been torn by the wind, was gradually collapsing, and its 5 passengers were engaged in a life-and-death struggle to keep their craft in the air. A dog had accompanied the passengers. Far below in the raging waters of the Pacific, the dog had sighted a tiny spot of land. The voyagers now steered for this place of refuge, which was their only hope for survival. 1/2 hour later, the balloon finally landed on its shore. Tired and shaken, the voyagers climbed from the tangles of cloth and rope and stepped onto dry land. Safe at last, the men looked at each other and realized to their horror that one of their number was missing. This man, the owner of the dog, had evidently fallen into the sea. At once, the 4 survivors began to search for him. The men who had just landed on this shore were not balloonists by profession. They were, in fact, American prisoners of war. That same year, the United States was engaged in a civil war between its northern and southern states. The 5 voyagers were Northerners who had fallen into enemy hands at Richmond, Virginia. There, by stealing a balloon which the Southerners had manufactured for their own use, they had made a daring escape during the storm. And who were these 5 men? The first was Captain Cyrus Harding, a brilliant engineer from Massachusetts. The second was Harding's most devoted friend, Nebuchadnezzar, otherwise known as Neb. Neb was a black man who had once worked for Harding's father. But the engineer who did not believe in slavery had long ago set him free. The third man was Gideon Spilett, a reporter for the New York Herald who had traveled all over the world and was famed for his writing. The fourth was a sailor named Pencroft, a strongly built fellow with bright, sparkling eyes. With him was a 15-year-old boy named Herbert, an orphan whom Pencroft loved as if he were his own son. The missing man was the engineer Cyrus Harding, who had escaped from the south along with his dog Top. Over and over the castaways called his name, but there was no response. Eventually, the little group split up. Neb and Spilett continued to search for Harding, while Pencroft and Herbert went to look for food and shelter. An abundant supply of shellfish and fresh water was soon found. Pencroft and Herbert also discovered something that might serve as a temporary shelter. It was a pile of enormous rocks which resembled chimneys, the openings of which could be stopped up with rocks and sand. Having labored for several hours to make the shelter livable, Pencroft and Herbert were rejoined by Neb and Spilett. But their 2 friends had bad news. The engineer, Cyrus Harding, had not been found. By the following evening, it began to look as though Harding were gone for good. Only Neb refused to give up hope and continued to search along the shore alone. That night, however, the reporter, Gideon Spilett, was jolted awake by a familiar sound. It was Top, Harding's dog. Spilett immediately roused Pencroft and Herbert, and the 3 men rushed outside. Following the dog, they came to a little cave. There they found Neb, kneeling beside a body. The body was that of Harding. Fortunately, Cyrus Harding was not dead, and his friends succeeded in reviving him. But when the engineer finally opened his eyes, a curious fact came to light. Harding had absolutely no recollection of how he had gotten from the sea to this little cave. It was almost as if an unknown power had moved him while he was still unconscious. The others did not think long about this mystery, though. They were simply overjoyed that Harding, the man most suited to be their leader, had been restored to them. As soon as the engineer had recovered his strength, the castaways climbed to the top of a high mountain in order to survey their new land. Here they discovered that chance had thrown them upon an island. In honor of their great president, Abraham Lincoln, the castaways named their new land Lincoln Island. When the little group returned from its expedition, the men immediately set to work on a new project. The castaways had no tools of any kind, and it was necessary for them to manufacture everything they needed from the rocks they found upon the island. Under the supervision of Harding, the castaways fashioned bricks from chunks of clay soil. With these bricks, they built an oven. Then they modeled a number of crude clay bowls and pots. When this task was finished, the engineer employed his knowledge of chemistry to refine iron from some ore that he had found. From this iron, the castaways fashioned all the tools that they would need. With the approach of winter, the new settlers soon realized that the chimneys would not serve to shelter them from the cold. Another, more suitable dwelling must be found. So, a second expedition was undertaken to find a new home. During this journey, a curious thing happened. Harding's dog Top plunged into the lake in pursuit of some unseen creature. Rushing to the banks of the water, the settlers saw an enormous head appear. It was a sea cow, the size of a small whale. As the settlers watched helplessly, the sea cow suddenly pounced upon the dog and dragged him beneath the surface of the water. Several terrible seconds passed by. Suddenly, to the amazement of the group, the dog was thrown up in the air by some unknown power, and still unharmed, it quickly swam to shore. Seconds later, the water turned blood red, and the lifeless body of the sea cow came into view. What had attacked it? No one could tell. Much bewildered by the incident, the settlers returned to their campsite. The following day, Cyrus Harding made an exciting discovery. By studying some curious currents in the lake, he realized that an underwater cave existed in the great granite cliffs that rose by the shore. Using natural elements on the island, the engineer devised a chemical explosive and blew up a certain portion of the cliff. The opening that was created by the explosion effectively drained some of the water of the lake. By lowering the level of the water, Harding also exposed the secret cave. Using some lighted branches as torches, the settlers now entered the cave and followed a long, winding passageway. They located a place where the wall seemed thinnest and went to work with their pickaxes to make a window. The window, which looked out over the sea, also fully illumined the interior of the cavern. The sight caused the men to gasp with admiration. The cavern looked like a fairyland cathedral. There were mighty pillars and fantastic arches, and the roof rose to the height of 80 feet. Seeking only a simple shelter, the settlers had found a palace. This would be their new home, and they called it Granite House. Now they felt safe at last. The 5 men soon learned how to use the other resources of the island. A seal hunt yielded huge quantities of animal fat from which they manufactured soap and candles. Various herbs located by Herbert were used to make spices, medicines, and tea. Bows and arrows were constructed, and Herbert and Spilett both became excellent hunters. One day, while the men were eating dinner, Pencroft, who was more than usually fond of good food, gave a cry of pain. He discovered a lead bullet buried in his meat. The settlers had been on the island for 7 months and had seen no sign of any human life. Now suddenly, here was proof that they weren't alone on the island. Some days later, the settlers made another remarkable discovery. They found a huge chest lying on the beach. Inside the chest was a storehouse of everything that the settlers might need to better their life on the island. There were tools of every description, cooking utensils, clothing, a telescope, guns, and ammunition. But how had the chest gotten there? Had there been a shipwreck? If so, why were there no other signs to be found of the wreckage? The men were completely bewildered. Some days later, with the aid of certain instruments and maps which had been found in the chest, Cyrus Harding discovered that Lincoln Island was only a couple of 100 miles away from another body of land called Tabor Island. The moment Pencroft heard this, he decided to visit the neighboring island and immediately began to build a little boat. Harding did not want to let Pencroft leave the group, but something happened which made him change his mind. On their first trial run with a new boat, the settlers discovered a bottle in the water. Inside the bottle was a note which read, "Castaway, Tabor Island," and also gave the island's exact location. Now it was imperative that Pencroft make his voyage, for the castaway must be rescued without delay. Accompanied by Herbert and Gideon Spilett, Pencroft soon set sail for Tabor Island, and a few days later, the boat came in sight of land. After exploring the island and finding no sign of human habitation, the three men finally discovered a little hut. The hut was filled with rusty tools and kettles, but everything was covered with a thick layer of dust. Clearly, no one had lived here for many years. Continuing their survey of the island, Pencroft and Spilett were startled by loud screams. Herbert was in trouble. Pencroft and Spilett ran to the boy's aid. When they arrived, they saw Herbert in the grasp of a savage creature, apparently some sort of gigantic ape. Throwing themselves at the animal, Pencroft and Spilett wrestled it to the ground. But when the ape had been safely bound with ropes, the settlers realized it wasn't an ape at all. The creature they had captured was a man. This, then, was the castaway of Tabor Island. But what had happened to him? If he had ever been a civilized being, his memory had long ago deserted him. His hair was shaggy, and his eyes were wild. His teeth were as sharp as the teeth of a wild beast. Realizing that it was their duty to help this man, the settlers brought him back to Lincoln Island and made a home for him at Granite House. The stranger slowly assumed a more human appearance, but he kept to himself and steadfastly refused to speak. But Harding was sure that the man had come to his senses. No doubt some enormous crime weighed on his soul. One day, the stranger vanished into the forest. Harding told his friends not to pursue him, for he was certain the stranger would return. The settlers heard terrible cries. Herbert had been cornered by a jaguar which was about to spring. But no sooner had the settlers arrived upon the scene when the stranger suddenly jumped from behind some bushes and courageously threw himself upon the beast. Mindful of the claws which tore his flesh, The stranger plunged his knife into the creature and stabbed it through the heart. The settlers were filled with gratitude, and they begged the stranger to come home with them, but the stranger still refused. Instead, he asked them for a simple favor. While living on the island, the settlers had domesticated certain wild sheep and goats. Recently, they had even built a small corral about 5 miles away from Granite House. The stranger's wish was to live at this corral and take care of the livestock. The settlers immediately gave their consent, and to make the stranger's life more comfortable, they built a small hut at the corral and stocked it with provisions. The stranger was moved by this generosity, and one day, as the settlers were eating dinner, the stranger paid them a visit at Granite House. He spoke quietly to them.
Gentlemen, I've decided that you should know my story, and I will tell it to you.
We ask you nothing, my friend. It's your right to be silent.
No, it's my duty to speak.
The stranger then proceeded to tell his tale. 12 years ago, the stranger had been a crew member on a British ship called the Britannia. But because of his attempts at mutiny, the captain had put him ashore on the coast of Australia. Here, the stranger, who called himself Ayrton, had become the leader of a gang of outlaws. About a year later, Ayrton chanced to meet a certain Scottish nobleman named Lord Glenarvan. This Lord Glenarvan was searching for the captain of the very ship on which Ayrton had served. Apparently, the captain, whose name was Grant, had been shipwrecked on some unknown land. When Ayrton heard that Lord Glenarvan was searching for Captain Grant, he immediately sent the nobleman on a wild goose chase through the forests of Australia. In the meantime, he made plans to capture Lord Glenarvan's ship, for he dreamed of turning it into a pirate vessel. However, through a series of odd coincidences, Ayrton's plan backfired. Instead of stealing the ship, he himself was captured and became Lord Glenarvan's prisoner. Fearing the thought of prison, Ayrton persuaded Lord Glenarvan to put him ashore on some uncharted island instead of turning him over to the police. Lord Glenarvan agreed to his request. He put Ayrton ashore on Tabor Island, where by chance he also found and rescued the shipwrecked Captain Grant. Alone on Tabor Island, Ayrton had lived and suffered 12 long years. All that had sustained him was Lord Glenarvan's promise that when Ayrton had paid for all his crimes, Lord Glenarvan would return and take him back to England. The settlers were very moved by Ayrton's story, and they quickly assured him he had more than atoned for his crimes. Once more, Harding begged Ayrton to live with the settlers, and once more he refused.
Very well, Ayrton. Do as you like.
But since it was your intention to live alone, why did you throw a document into the sea which told us where to find you?
A document?
Yes, the note that we found in the bottle, giving the exact location of Tabor Island.
I never threw any document into the sea. No, I'm quite sure of that. Never.
The settlers were certain that Ayrton had forgotten, that he had just suffered a lapse of memory. But Cyrus Harding was not so sure. A number of incidents had happened in the past months which were so strange as to be almost supernatural. Clearly, there was some strange force at work on the island which was favorable to the colonists, but whose nature remained unknown. Harding was determined to solve the mystery. With the approach of spring, Gideon Spilett and Herbert amused themselves by taking pictures with a camera they had found in the chest. One day, Herbert took a picture of the ocean from one of the windows of Granite House. But what was his surprise when a curious speck he saw on the photograph turned out to be the sails of a distant ship. But the ship was not Lord Glenarvan's yacht, the Duncan, as everyone had hoped. For the flag this vessel flew was solid black, which could only mean that it was a pirate ship. Seeking to aid his friends in the face of this terror, Ayrton now suggested a bold plan. He would swim to the side of the vessel during the night and try to find out the approximate size of the crew. The plan was carried out, and Ayrton secretly boarded the pirate ship. But learning that his friends were vastly outnumbered, Ayrton resolved to perform an heroic act. He would fire a shot into the ammunition cabin and blow up the vessel along with himself. Stepping carefully over the sleeping pirates, Ayrton made his way along the deck. Suddenly, a harsh voice rang out, and Ayrton found himself facing the pirate captain. A terrible fight ensued. Several of the pirates awoke and rushed at Ayrton, who fired his revolver into their midst. Then, jumping over the side of the ship, Ayrton swiftly swam back to the island beneath a hail of bullets. The settlers were determined to defend their island, and they hoped that their bullets would keep the intruders away. But as the ship drew close to land, a strange thing happened. The pirate vessel suddenly split in two, and in less than 10 seconds, it was swallowed up, along with all its crew. The settlers were puzzled by the explosion, for they did not know what could have caused the wreck. Then, a week or two later, they found the answer. While Neb was taking a walk along the beach, he discovered the remains of a torpedo. But who had torpedoed the ship? No one could say. It was one more mystery about the island. Several weeks passed and life returned to normal. The settlers knew that 6 pirates were still on the island, for these men had reached shore before their ship was wrecked. But since the pirates had not caused any trouble, the settlers thought it best to leave them alone. Then one day, a terrible thing happened. Harding had constructed a telegraphic device which connected the corral to Granite House. When Ayrton failed to answer a telegraph message, the settlers knew that something was wrong. Leaving Neb to guard Granite House, Harding, Pencroft, Herbert, and Spilett armed themselves and ran to the corral. But no sooner had the men arrived when a shot rang out, and Herbert fell to the ground. At once, the settlers rushed to help the boy. Meanwhile, Harding captured Herbert's attacker and stabbed the pirate through the heart with his knife. Herbert was alive, but he was gravely wounded. The bullet had gone directly through his chest. Since the boy was too weak to be moved, the settlers were forced to remain at the corral, but there was still no sign of Ayrton. Some weeks later, Herbert was a little better, and learning that the pirates had devastated their farm, the settlers finally returned to Granite House. Unfortunately, Herbert lost consciousness during the trip and soon developed an alarming fever. Taken to his room inside the cave, he was given every possible care, but without quinine, the one medicine that could cure him, the boy was clearly doomed. The following morning, Herbert uttered a shrill, piercing cry, and Neb, who had been sitting with him, ran into the next room to get the other settlers. At that moment, Top began to bark in a strange manner. Rushing into the room, the settlers tried to restrain the dying boy, who was attempting to throw himself out of bed. It was 5 o'clock in the morning, and the rising sun had begun to shine in at the windows. Suddenly, a ray of light shone on the table that stood by Herbert's bed. Uttering an astonished cry, Pencroft pointed to the table. On it lay a little oblong box. It was labeled sulfate of quinine. No one knew who had put the box there. When Herbert had sufficiently recovered, the settlers decided to tour the island again. Their purpose was twofold. On the one hand, they hoped to rescue Ayrton if he was still alive. But they also hoped to find the mysterious being who had time and again come to their aid. As they were returning from this tour, the men saw a light in the hut at the corral. Certain that the pirates had taken refuge here, the group slowly crept up to the hut and gazed in through the windows. On the bed inside, they saw a sleeping man. His face showed signs of tremendous suffering. Bruises were visible on his wrists and ankles. It was Ayrton. With cries of joy, the settlers ran to his side. Suddenly, the men heard the barking of Harding's dog. Following the sound, the men reached a little stream, and there, in the moonlight, they saw an amazing sight. Stretched out on the banks of the stream were 5 corpses, the bodies of the pirates who had landed on Lincoln Island. How had it happened? Who had killed the pirates? Ayrton, when he recovered, could not say. Held prisoner and tortured by the pirates, Ayrton finally had lost consciousness, and that was all that he could remember. He had no recollection of coming back to the corral. Harding and his men were now more determined than ever to find the mysterious benefactor of the island and repay him in some way for his good deeds. Unfortunately, it was no longer possible to explore the island in Pencroft's little boat, for the pirates, before they were slain, had discovered the craft and smashed it on the rocks. The loss of the boat was a double blow to the settlers. They had long planned to go to Tabor Island and leave a note for Lord Glenarvan should he return. When another expedition failed to turn up any sign of the benefactor, the settlers finally returned to Granite House and began construction of another vessel. Using the wreckage of the pirate ship, the men planned to build themselves a boat that was large enough to take them back to America. Meanwhile, the men observed a curious sight. They had long believed that the mountain on their island was an extinct volcano, but suddenly the volcano had awakened, and fire and smoke began to issue from its mouth. One day, when all the settlers, including Ayrton, were gathered at Granite House, a strange thing happened. The telegraph bell suddenly rang, and a message came over the machine. The message told the settlers to come to the corral. The settlers were overjoyed. They were certain the message was from their benefactor and that he was about to reveal himself at last. Unmindful of a storm which had suddenly arisen, the settlers ran to the hut at the corral. There they discovered a note. The note told them to follow a new wire which had been attached to the telegraph machine. After a brief search, the new wire was found, and the settlers began to follow it to its source. What was their amazement when the wire ran to the very edge of the ocean and suddenly disappeared into the sea. The settlers were amazed. Evidently, there was an underground cavern here. But how could anyone reach it? It was Harding who provided the answer. The group must simply wait till the tide went down. An hour after midnight, the tide went down, and the mouth of a large cavern was revealed. Inside the cavern was a boat moored to a jagged rock. Climbing into the boat, the settlers proceeded down a winding passage. At the end of the passage, the men saw a brilliant light which flooded every corner of the cavern and clearly came from an electric source. At this point, the walls of the cavern widened, forming the boundaries of a little lake. In the center of this lake lay a long, cigar-shaped object which somewhat resembled an enormous whale. It was from this object that the light emanated. With tremendous emotion, Harding seized Spilett by the arm.
He! It can only be he!
An outlawed man!
Both the engineer and the reporter knew that the strange craft anchored in these waters could belong to only one man in the world, Captain Nemo, master of the submarine ship, the Nautilus. Descending into the ship through an open hatchway, the group found their way to a huge room. It was like a museum, heaped high with treasures of the mineral world, along with works of art and marvels of science. Stretched out on a rich sofa, they saw a magnificent old man. His head was noble, his eyes were sharp and piercing, and his hair was long and white.
Captain Nemo, you asked for us. We are here.
At these words, the old man rose to his feet. It was evident that his strength had been undermined by a long illness.
Sir, I have no name.
Nevertheless, I know you.
The old man fell back upon the sofa.
Well, after all, what does it matter now? I'm dying.
Captain Nemo motioned the settlers to be seated, and they obeyed him. All regarded him with profound emotion. But how had Harding recognized Captain Nemo? The answer was quite simple. Captain Nemo was indeed a famous outlaw. But some years before, he had rescued 3 men who had been cast on board his ship by chance. These men later escaped during a storm in which the captain believed they had died. Afterwards, one of the men had written a book about the captain and his submarine. The book was called 20,000 Leagues Under the Sea. Captain Nemo sneered when he heard this news. No doubt the author had depicted him as a gangster, a rebel against humanity. Then, wishing to explain his past life, Captain Nemo told this simple story. The captain had been born Prince Dakkar, the son of an Indian Rajah who ruled the territory of Bundelkund. When the prince was only 10, his father sent him to Europe to be educated. Being unusually intelligent, Dakkar had accumulated every kind of knowledge and had become an artist, philosopher, and statesman. At that time, India was ruled by England. When Prince Dakkar returned to Bundelkund, he joined several other Indian princes in an unsuccessful revolt against the British crown. After this revolt, Prince Dakkar became an outlaw with a price upon his head. Filled with bitterness and a profound disgust for all humanity, Dakkar had built his submarine and disappeared beneath the sea. Over a period of many years, Captain Nemo had visited every ocean in the world and had collected priceless treasures from vessels which had foundered. Meanwhile, the Nautilus, taken for a pirate craft, had been ruthlessly hunted by ships of every nation. For the past 6 years, against his will, the captain had remained at Lincoln Island. Volcanic action had moved the walls of his cavern, and his submarine was now hopelessly trapped. One day, while exploring the sea in his diving suit, the captain had seen the descent of the balloon and the landing of the settlers. It was he who had rescued Harding from the ocean and had brought his body to the little cave. Later, almost in spite of himself, Nemo found himself taking an interest in the settlers, who he saw were honest and energetic men. By means of the diving suit, Nemo could reach the well of Granite House and listen with ease to the settlers' conversations. It was Nemo who had rescued Top from the sea cow, who had given the settlers the wonderful chest full of tools, who had saved the settlers from death at the hands of the pirates, and who had brought the quinine that had saved Herbert's life. Now Captain Nemo was dying, and he wanted the settlers to do one service for him. After his death, they were to sink his vessel along with all its treasures. The men might take but one chest full of jewels, which Nemo knew they would put to good use if they ever regained their homeland. The settlers were obliged to follow Nemo's request. On the day following the captain's death, the Nautilus was sunk to the bottom of the lake, according to the captain's instructions. Then, their hearts full of sorrow, the colonists returned to their island home. The 6 men now threw themselves into the task of finishing their vessel, for the thunderings that rose from the volcano were becoming more and more ominous. The very ground was rumbling and shaking, and the sky was ablaze with fire. Cyrus Harding brooded over a secret that Captain Nemo had told him before his death. At last, he could keep it to himself no longer. Calling his friends, he told them what he knew. The awful truth was that Lincoln Island was doomed. The walls of Nemo's cavern were only separated from the shaft of the volcano by a thin wall of stone. The moment the wall gave way, the water from the sea would penetrate the volcano and be turned into steam. When this happened, the whole island would explode into fragments, and the land would sink forever beneath the sea. Learning that their lives were now in danger, the settlers began to labor day and night in an effort to finish their vessel. Meanwhile, the forests were covered with black ashes, and torrents of lava fell towards the boiling sea. The day before the vessel was to be launched, an enormous column of vapor rose from the volcano to the height of 1,000 feet. Then there was an explosion which might have been heard 100 miles away. At that very instant, fragments of mountain fell into the Pacific, and Lincoln Island collapsed into the sea. Meanwhile, what had happened to the settlers? The 6 men had been thrown into the sea, where they swam to a solitary rock that was all that remained of the island. A few provisions were all that they had saved, along with Captain Nemo's chest of jewels. Here, for 9 days, the men waited for death. Under these circumstances, there was no hope left. But on the 10th day, Ayrton caught sight of a sail on the horizon, and a brief cry escaped his parched lips.
The Duncan! It's the Duncan!
Then Ayrton fell back unconscious. When Cyrus Harding and his friends opened their eyes again, they found themselves in the cabin of a steamer. It was, in fact, Lord Glenarvan's ship, the Duncan, which was now commanded by the son of Captain Grant. The settlers were not only saved, but already on their way back to America.
But Captain Grant, tell me, who could have told you to come to Lincoln Island when you didn't find Ayrton on Tabor?
Why, Captain Harding, I knew of Lincoln Island by a document you left on Tabor Island.
A document?
Yes, here it is.
Captain Grant then produced a paper which indicated the position of Lincoln Island and the presence of Ayrton and 5 American settlers. The moment Harding saw the handwriting, he understood what had happened. Sometime before his death, Captain Nemo had borrowed Pencroft's little boat and had traveled to Tabor Island to leave this message. A few weeks later, the castaways landed in America. and found the Civil War over and their country once more at peace. With the treasure Captain Nemo had given them, the settlers purchased land in Iowa and founded a colony which they named after their island. Here the 6 men lived together for the rest of their lives and were as happy as they had been in the past. But they never forgot the island which had been their home for so long and which was now the lonely tomb of Captain Nemo.